I never imagined that the most difficult question of my life would come from someone who still needed help tying his shoes. I'm 86 years old and I've lived a quiet life in a small countryside town where the mornings smell like wet grass and the evenings fade slowly into long golden sunsets. My name is George, and for more than 60 years my world has revolved around the same woman, my wife Rosie. We raised two children here, a son and a daughter, both grown now, both happily married with families of their own, and most days our home feels peaceful, predictable, almost finished. The kind of life that makes you believe you've already answered all the important questions. But last Sunday afternoon proved me wrong. It was one of those calm family visits when everyone gathers in the backyard. My daughter was laughing in the kitchen with Rosie, while my son was fixing something on the old fence he insists still needs repairs every time he visits. The grandchildren were scattered across the yard, chasing each other through the tall grass, their voices echoing through the fields, like little birds that refuse to stay quiet. I was sitting on the wooden bench beneath the big oak tree, the same bench I built with my own hands almost 40 years ago, watching it all unfold the way old men tend to do, quietly, gratefully, from a distance. That's when my youngest grandson walked over. He climbed onto the bench beside me, swinging his small legs back and forth, like he always does when he's thinking about something serious. I remember noticing how focused he looked, the way children do when they're about to ask something that's been circling in their minds for a while. He looked up at me, squinting slightly in the sunlight, and then he asked a question so simple, yet so impossible, that it stopped my heart for a moment. He said, "Grandpa, if you could live your whole life again, would you change anything?" And just like that, the afternoon went quiet. Not outside. The kids were still laughing, the wind still moved through the trees, and Rosie was still talking somewhere behind me in the kitchen. But inside my mind, everything froze. I opened my mouth to answer, the way grown-ups usually do when children ask questions, but nothing came out. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't sure I knew the truth. And the worst part? My grandson was still waiting for an answer. But the real problem wasn't the question itself. The real problem was what that question forced me to remember. And as I sat there staring across the fields, something from my past began to rise slowly to the surface. Something I hadn't thought about in decades. Something that made answering that question far more difficult than anyone in that backyard could imagine. And the moment I realized what it was, I knew this question wasn't going away. I managed to smile at my grandson and pat his shoulder, telling him I needed to think about it for a while, the kind of answer adults give when they don't really have one yet. He seemed satisfied enough and ran back across the yard to join the others, leaving me alone on the bench with a question that suddenly felt much heavier than it should have been. At first I thought it would pass, like most small thoughts do, but something about the way he asked it kept echoing in my mind as the afternoon slowly turned into evening. Because the truth is, when you reach 86 years old, people assume you already understand your life. They think time automatically gives you clarity, that after decades of living, loving, working, and raising children, You somehow arrive at a place where everything makes sense. But sitting there beneath that old oak tree, I realized something unsettling. I had never actually asked myself that question before. Would I change anything? It sounds simple, but the more I thought about it, the more complicated it became. Because answering honestly means reopening doors that have been closed for years. It means revisiting choices you made when you were younger, decisions that shape not only your life, but the lives of the people you love. And the longer I sat there, the more memories began to surface, one after another, like old photographs floating to the top of a forgotten box. I remembered the day I first met Rosie, when she was standing outside a small grocery store in town, wearing a yellow dress that moved gently in the summer wind. I remembered the nervous way I introduced myself, pretending I wasn't completely captivated by the way she smiled. That moment changed everything for me, and even now, after all these years, it still feels like the beginning of the life I was meant to live. But that memory led to another one, and that one wasn't as easy to hold. Because long before Rosie and I built the life we have now, there was a time when I almost walked away from it. A decision I made when I was younger, stubborn, proud, convinced that I understood the world better than I actually did. And as the evening shadows stretched across the fields, I began to wonder something that unsettled me more than the original question. What if that one decision had gone differently? Would my life look the same today? Would I still be sitting on this bench with the same family laughing across the yard? Or would everything I love simply not exist? And that's when the question my grandson asked stopped being hypothetical. Because suddenly, it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the truth I had never fully faced. There was a time, many years ago, when I believed that being right mattered more than being kind. I was in my 30s then, working long days trying to build a stable life for our growing family, convinced that responsibility meant carrying the weight of everything on my shoulders alone. Rosie and I had been married for nearly 10 years, and like many young couples trying to find their footing, we argued more than we admitted to anyone else. Looking back now, I can see that most of those arguments were small things, pretending to be big things. Bills that needed paying, plans that didn't align, expectations we never properly explained to each other. But at the time, those disagreements felt enormous. They felt like proof that something in our marriage wasn't working the way it should. And one night, after a long, exhausting day, we had the worst argument of our lives. I still remember the silence that followed it. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy kind that fills a room when two people say things they can't take back. I walked out of the house that night and sat in my truck for nearly an hour staring at the road ahead, convinced that maybe the easiest solution was simply to keep driving. That thought stayed with me longer than I like to admit, because when pride enters a relationship, it has a strange way of convincing you that leaving might be easier than staying. And for a brief moment, I almost believed it. But then something happened that changed everything. As I sat there gripping the steering wheel, ready to make a decision that would have altered the entire course of my life, I looked back at the house. Through the living room window, I could see Rosie sitting on the couch with our two young children curled up beside her. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't yelling. She was simply holding them, quietly, like she was protecting the only thing that truly mattered. And in that moment, I realized something that took me years to fully understand. Leaving would have been the easier choice, but it would have been the wrong one. So I turned the engine off, walked back inside, and sat down beside the woman who had chosen to build a life with me, even when I made it difficult. That night didn't magically fix everything, but it changed the direction of our story. And now, decades later, watching our grandchildren run across the same yard where our children once played, I understand something I didn't understand back then. One decision, one moment of humility can protect an entire lifetime. But remembering that moment also forced me to face a deeper truth. Because if I answered my grandson honestly, it meant admitting something most people don't like to admit about their past. And the answer to his question wasn't as simple as yes or no. That evening after everyone left, the house grew quiet again. Rosie had gone inside to wash the dishes while I remained outside on the porch, watching the last light disappear behind the hills. The same question still lingered in my mind, circling slowly like a bird that refuses to land. Would I change anything? At first, the honest answer seemed obvious. Of course I would. I could think of dozens of mistakes I made over the years, moments where I said the wrong thing, times I worked too much, evenings when I chose pride over patience. If someone offered me the chance to go back and fix those moments, part of me believed I should take it. But the longer I sat there thinking about it, the more complicated the answer became. Because every mistake I remembered was somehow connected to something beautiful that came later. The argument that almost drove me away from Rosie eventually taught me how to listen to her in ways I never had before. The years I spent working too hard eventually allowed our children to grow up without the struggles my own parents faced. Even the regrets I carry today helped shape the man sitting on that porch. And slowly, a realization began to settle in. Changing the past doesn't just erase mistakes, it also erases the lessons those mistakes created. If I removed every regret from my life, would I still be the same man who learned patience, humility, and gratitude? Or would I simply become a different person entirely? Someone who never understood how fragile and valuable love truly is. That's when the answer finally came to me. Not quickly, not easily, but quietly, like truth often does when you give it enough time. But there was still one final step left, because the next morning my grandson was coming back to visit, and he was going to ask that question again. The following afternoon, just as I expected, my grandson came running up the path toward the porch with the same curious look on his face. Children have a remarkable memory for unfinished conversations, especially when adults promise answers they haven't yet delivered. He climbed onto the chair beside me, looked up with those same patient eyes, and asked the question again. "Grandpa, did you figure it out?" For a moment, I watched the wind move through the fields, the way it has every day of my life here. I thought about the young man I used to be, the mistakes I made, the decisions that shaped everything that followed. And then I looked at my grandson, realizing that this simple question had done something unexpected. It hadn't just made me think about my past, it had made me appreciate it. So I took a deep breath and gave him the most honest answer I could. I told him that yes, there are many moments in my life that were difficult, painful, or filled with mistakes. There were times I wish I had been wiser, kinder, or more patient. But if someone truly offered me the chance to live my life again and change those moments, I wouldn't take it. Because every single choice I made, even the wrong ones, somehow led me here, to this porch, to this quiet countryside home, to the family laughing inside the house, and most importantly, to the people I love. My grandson thought about that for a moment, the way children do when they're trying to understand something bigger than themselves. Then he nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense in a way he couldn't quite explain yet. And as he ran back across the yard to join the others, I realized something that surprised me. The question that left me speechless yesterday had actually given me something I didn't realize I needed: peace. Because sometimes the hardest questions in life aren't meant to trap us. They're meant to remind us of how far we've come. And at 86 years old, sitting beside the woman who walked this entire road with me, I finally understood something simple but powerful. A life without mistakes might sound perfect, but a life that turns mistakes into wisdom is far more valuable. And strangely enough, it took a child's question to help me see it.